The United States is approaching a moment that many in Washington never believed would arrive. A moment when military superiority is no longer enough, economic pressure is no longer enough, and political intimidation is no longer enough. Right now, a confrontation is unfolding that could determine not only the future of Iran, but the future credibility of American power itself. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why some of the most experienced military strategists in the world are beginning to ask a question that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago. What if the United States cannot achieve its objectives, no matter how much force it brings to the table? That's the real story. Because this isn't about another crisis in the Middle East. This isn't about another round of sanctions. This isn't about another military deployment. This is about the collision between two completely different visions of how the world should operate. And the consequences are growing larger by the day. For decades, American policymakers operated under a simple assumption. If a country challenged U.S. interests, Washington could apply pressure. Economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, military pressure. Eventually, that country would either compromise or collapse. That model appeared to work repeatedly after the Cold War. Iraq was isolated. Libya was isolated. Serbia was isolated. Afghanistan was invaded. Governments fell. Leaders were removed. Washington became accustomed to the idea that resistance was ultimately futile. But what happens when a country refuses to follow that script? What happens when a country spends decades preparing specifically for economic warfare, military pressure, and political isolation? What happens when that country understands that survival itself can become a form of victory? That's where Iran enters the picture. And if you thought that was bad, it's only going to get worse from now on. Because Iran has spent more than 40 years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. While many governments focused on prosperity, political popularity, and short-term objectives, Iran focused on endurance. It built a strategy around surviving pressure rather than avoiding it. Every sanction imposed, every threat issued, every attempt at isolation. Instead of forcing surrender, it pushed Iran to adapt. Think about that for a moment. Most countries depend on stability. Iran learned to function under instability. Most countries depend on international acceptance. Iran learned to survive without it. Most countries assume access to global financial systems. Iran learned how to operate despite restrictions. This doesn't mean Iran is stronger than the United States. Far from it. What it means is that Iran became exceptionally difficult to coerce. And coercion has been the foundation of much of modern American foreign policy. That's why this crisis matters so much. Because if coercion no longer works, then an enormous portion of Washington's strategic toolkit becomes less effective. Now let's talk about something even more important: deterrence. This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in international relations. People hear the word deterrence and immediately think about weapons, missiles, bombers, aircraft carriers, nuclear arsenals. But real deterrence isn't about possessing weapons. It's about convincing your opponent that the cost of action exceeds the potential benefit. And this is where the situation becomes deeply uncomfortable for American planners, because despite possessing overwhelming military superiority, the United States remains constrained. Why? Because every option carries consequences. A larger military campaign risks economic catastrophe. A blockade risks escalation. An attack risks regional war. Inaction risks political humiliation. Notice the pattern. Every available choice creates new problems. That's not strategic freedom. That's strategic entrapment. And some of the smartest military thinkers in the world recognize it. Stay with me, because the next development explains why the global economy is becoming one of the most important battlegrounds in this entire confrontation. For years, analysts warned about the vulnerability of global supply chains. Most people ignored those warnings. Then came disruptions, pandemics, conflicts, shipping crises, energy shocks. Suddenly, everyone realized how interconnected the modern world had become. Now imagine introducing a major conflict into one of the most important energy corridors on Earth. The consequences become enormous. Oil prices surge. Transportation costs rise. Manufacturing slows. Food production becomes more expensive. Developing nations suffer. Industrial nations suffer. Financial markets panic. This is why the Strait of Hormuz remains so important. Not because of symbolism, because of economics. The modern world runs on energy, and energy flows through geography. Iran understands this perfectly. Many Western observers continue making the mistake of viewing military power as the only relevant variable. Iran doesn't. Iran understands leverage. It understands geography. It understands economics. And perhaps most importantly, it understands patience. Patience is a weapon. History repeatedly demonstrates this. The stronger military doesn't always win. The side willing to endure often prevails. The United States learned that lesson in Vietnam. The Soviet Union learned it in Afghanistan. Now Washington faces another version of the same challenge. Not an identical challenge, but a similar strategic dilemma. Can military power produce political outcomes? Or will pressure simply strengthen resistance? That's the question hanging over every decision being made right now. Now let's talk about President Trump. Because regardless of whether people support him or oppose him, one reality cannot be ignored. He faces extraordinarily difficult choices. If he escalates, he risks triggering consequences that extend far beyond Iran. If he de-escalates, opponents will portray it as weakness. If he negotiates, critics will accuse him of surrender. If he refuses to negotiate, instability continues. This is what strategic traps look like. Every pathway carries danger. Every decision creates political costs. And every delay increases uncertainty. But the most dangerous part may be something else entirely. The growing gap between political rhetoric and strategic reality. For years, American politicians have promised decisive outcomes, quick victories, simple solutions, clear successes. Reality rarely cooperates. Real geopolitics is complicated. Real wars are unpredictable. Real adversaries adapt. And adaptation is exactly what Iran has demonstrated. While Washington debates options, Tehran continues functioning. While sanctions expand, Iran continues operating. While threats increase, Iran continues resisting. Again, that doesn't mean Iran is winning. It means Iran is surviving. And survival changes the strategic equation. Because every month that passes without a decisive outcome raises uncomfortable questions. Questions allies begin asking. Questions adversaries begin asking. Questions markets begin asking. Questions voters eventually begin asking. Can American power still achieve the results it promises? Now, if you've stayed with me this far, the next point may be the most important of all. This crisis isn't being watched only by Iran and the United States. China is watching. Russia is watching. India is watching. Saudi Arabia is watching. Turkey is watching. Europe is watching. Every major power is studying what happens next. Why? Because the outcome will influence how countries think about power in the 21st century. For decades, the world operated under assumptions created during the unipolar era. The United States stood alone at the top. Its economy dominated. Its military dominated. Its alliances dominated. Its financial system dominated. That period is ending. Not because America is collapsing, not because China is taking over, but because power is becoming distributed among multiple centers. That's the reality of multipolarity. And multipolarity changes everything. Countries gain options. Partnerships diversify. Economic relationships multiply. Political leverage shifts. The ability of any single country to impose outcomes declines. That's what makes this moment so significant. The confrontation with Iran is happening during one of the largest geopolitical transitions since the end of the Cold War. And transitions are dangerous because old assumptions stop working before new systems fully emerge. That creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates instability. Now let's examine China's role because many people misunderstand Beijing's calculations. China does not want a wider war. A wider war threatens trade, threatens energy flows, threatens economic growth, threatens investment, threatens supply chains. China benefits from stability. However, China also has no interest in seeing Iran destroyed. Why? Because Iran occupies a critical strategic position. It connects regions. It influences trade corridors. It affects energy security. It matters to long-term Eurasian integration. That's why Beijing views Iran differently than Washington does. To many American policymakers, Iran is a problem. To China, Iran is a strategic partner. Those perspectives naturally create friction. And that friction extends far beyond the Middle East. Because every major geopolitical issue today is connected. Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Red Sea, Iran, they're all part of a larger struggle over the future international order. And if you thought that struggle was slowing down, think again. It's accelerating. Now here's where things become truly dangerous. Many leaders still behave as though they are operating in the world of 1995, a world where American power faced no serious peer competition, a world where military intervention carried fewer risks, a world where economic globalization remained largely uncontested. That world no longer exists. The problem is that strategies built for that world continue influencing decisions today. And when outdated assumptions collide with modern realities, mistakes become more likely. Large mistakes, expensive mistakes, potentially catastrophic mistakes. History is filled with examples of great powers misreading transitions. Empires often struggle to recognize changing circumstances. They continue pursuing objectives designed for a world that no longer exists. By the time they adjust, enormous damage has already been done. That is why this crisis matters. Not because of one battle, not because of one speech, not because of one negotiation, but because it may reveal whether American policymakers have truly adapted to the emerging realities of the 21st century. And what happens next could be even more shocking than what we've discussed so far. Because beneath the military standoff, beneath the economic pressure, and beneath the political rhetoric, a much larger question is beginning to emerge: whether the entire architecture of American global leadership is entering a period of irreversible transformation. What makes this moment so extraordinary is that the crisis has already moved beyond the battlefield. Most people are still focused on missiles, military deployments, naval movements, and political speeches. Those things matter. They always matter. But the deeper story is unfolding beneath the surface, where strategic perceptions are changing in ways that could reshape international politics for decades. Because once nations begin losing confidence in a system, that system starts weakening long before any official announcement is ever made. And that's exactly what we may be witnessing today. Think about it from the perspective of America's allies. For 70 years, the United States offered something few nations could provide: security guarantees backed by overwhelming power. If a country aligned itself with Washington, it gained access to military protection, financial systems, intelligence cooperation, and economic opportunities. That arrangement formed the backbone of the post-World War II order. But what happens when allies begin asking uncomfortable questions? What happens when governments start wondering whether those guarantees remain credible under modern conditions? What happens when they observe a conflict where the most powerful military alliance in history struggles to achieve its political objectives? Those questions don't stay confined to one region. They spread, and if you thought that was bad, it's only going to get worse from now on. Because uncertainty is contagious, one country begins reassessing, then another, then another. Before long, strategic calculations begin shifting everywhere simultaneously. Look at what's already happening. Saudi Arabia is diversifying partnerships. Turkey is pursuing greater independence. India is balancing between major powers. China is expanding economic influence. Russia continues challenging Western assumptions. Even traditional American allies increasingly talk about strategic autonomy. None of these developments happened overnight, but they are accelerating. And acceleration matters, because geopolitical change often appears slow until suddenly it isn't. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. Empires don't wake up one morning and discover they've lost influence. Instead, influence erodes gradually. Allies become less dependent. Adversaries become more confident. Neutral countries become less willing to choose sides. The cumulative effect becomes visible only after years of transformation. That's where the danger lies. The greatest strategic threats are often invisible until they're impossible to ignore. Now let's talk about military power itself, because this crisis is exposing something many analysts have been warning about for years. Military superiority remains important. It remains valuable. It remains necessary. But it is no longer sufficient. That's the critical distinction. For decades, military dominance allowed the United States to shape outcomes across multiple regions simultaneously. But modern warfare is changing. Technology is changing. Economics are changing. Geography remains important. And increasingly, relatively smaller powers possess capabilities that can impose enormous costs on much larger adversaries. This isn't a revolutionary idea. It's happened throughout history. Small powers learn how to exploit vulnerabilities. They identify asymmetries. They focus on endurance. They increase the cost of intervention. And eventually, even stronger opponents begin questioning whether the objective justifies the expense. That's precisely what Iran has done. Again, this doesn't mean Iran is stronger than the United States. It means Iran understands the strategic environment. It understands where American advantages exist. But it also understands where American vulnerabilities exist, and those vulnerabilities matter. Now consider the economic dimension. The modern global economy is built upon assumptions about stability, assumptions about trade, assumptions about energy flows, assumptions about predictable markets. When those assumptions weaken, economic consequences emerge rapidly. Investors become nervous. Governments become nervous. Businesses become nervous. Consumers become nervous. And fear itself becomes a force multiplier. This is why every discussion about military escalation immediately triggers discussions about energy markets. Because markets understand something politicians often ignore. Economic systems are fragile, far more fragile than most people realize. A disruption doesn't need to be permanent to be damaging. It only needs to create uncertainty. That's enough. And uncertainty is exactly what this crisis continues producing. Stay with me because the next point explains why the world may never return to the geopolitical assumptions that existed before this confrontation. The rise of multipolarity isn't a theory anymore. It's a reality. For years, people debated whether a multipolar world was emerging. Now, the evidence is increasingly difficult to deny. China has become an economic superpower. Russia remains a military power. India continues growing. Regional actors are becoming more independent. Alternative financial arrangements are expanding. Trade relationships are diversifying. And the ability of any single country to dominate global affairs is gradually declining. This doesn't mean the United States disappears. Far from it. America remains one of the most powerful nations in human history. But power is becoming shared. That's the difference. And shared power requires different strategies, different expectations, different approaches. The problem is that many institutions still operate according to assumptions created during the unipolar era. Those assumptions no longer match reality. And when institutions fail to adapt, crises become more likely, because decisions are being made using outdated frameworks. Now let's talk about negotiations, because eventually every conflict reaches the same crossroads. Continue fighting or start talking. History shows that even the bitterest enemies eventually negotiate. The question isn't whether negotiations occur. The question is under what conditions. And this is where the current situation becomes extremely complicated. Trust has collapsed. Trust between governments, trust between leaders, trust between institutions, trust between entire populations. Rebuilding trust is infinitely harder than destroying it. A missile strike can occur in minutes. Trust takes years, sometimes decades. And without trust, negotiations become extraordinarily difficult. Every proposal is viewed with suspicion. Every concession is interpreted as weakness. Every agreement appears temporary. This is why diplomatic solutions often emerge only after both sides recognize that military solutions are unattainable. That recognition hasn't fully occurred yet, but signs are beginning to appear because reality has a way of imposing itself on political narratives. Eventually, facts matter. Eventually, outcomes matter. Eventually, leaders must confront results rather than expectations. And that's exactly where this crisis is heading. Now, here's the truly remarkable part. Many people still believe the confrontation is primarily about nuclear issues, military issues, or regional issues. Those issues matter, but they are not the entire story. The deeper issue is sovereignty. The deeper issue is whether nations retain the ability to determine their own political futures without external coercion. That's why so many countries are paying attention. Because regardless of how they feel about Iran, they understand the broader implications. If pressure succeeds, one precedent is established. If resistance succeeds, a different precedent is established. Either way, the outcome influences future geopolitical calculations around the world. And that makes this far bigger than a regional dispute. Now let's return to President Trump, because his position illustrates the broader dilemma facing American leadership. Every available option carries costs. Escalation carries costs. De-escalation carries costs. Negotiation carries costs. Delay carries costs. This is what happens when strategic flexibility narrows. Choices become harder. Mistakes become more expensive. And political pressure increases. The challenge isn't simply finding a solution. The challenge is finding a solution that multiple audiences can accept simultaneously. Domestic audiences, international audiences, allies, markets, military institutions, political supporters. That's an extraordinarily difficult balancing act, and history suggests very few leaders manage it perfectly, which brings us to perhaps the most important conclusion of all. The real lesson of this crisis isn't about Iran alone. It isn't about Trump alone. It isn't about Israel alone. It's about the changing nature of power itself. Power today looks different than it did 20 years ago. Economic resilience matters more. Technology matters more. Supply chains matter more. Public perception matters more. Information warfare matters more. And the ability to impose outcomes through force alone matters less than many policymakers would like to admit. That's the transformation unfolding before our eyes. A transformation many leaders still resist acknowledging. But reality doesn't wait for political acceptance. Reality moves forward regardless. And the countries that adapt earliest usually gain advantages. The countries that cling to outdated assumptions often pay the highest price. That is why this confrontation may ultimately be remembered not as a military crisis, but as a turning point in global history. A moment when the world began recognizing that the era of uncontested dominance was ending. A moment when new power centers became impossible to ignore. A moment when old strategic assumptions collided with new geopolitical realities. And perhaps most importantly, a moment when nations everywhere began preparing for a future that looks fundamentally different from the past. Because once the world starts moving toward a new order, there is no guarantee it can ever go back to the old one.